Have you ever felt like you're working harder than everyone around you, yet somehow still falling behind? Maybe you're the first person in the office every morning and the last to leave at night, but your results never seem to reflect the effort you put in. Maybe you work 12-hour days while someone else works half the time and still gets promoted ahead of you. Or perhaps you're exhausted, burned out, barely sleeping, while others appear to succeed with far less struggle. If you've ever wondered why hard work alone doesn't guarantee success, if you're tired of being constantly exhausted with little to show for it, then this story may change the way you think about work forever. Because there once was a farmer who nearly destroyed his life through relentless effort until a single encounter taught him the critical difference between working hard and working wisely. Stay with me until the end. In a quiet farming valley where families had cultivated the land for generations, there lived a 32-year-old farmer named Thomas. He owned a modest 10-acre farm inherited from his father, and above all else, Thomas believed in one principle: hard work. Every morning before sunrise, Thomas was already in the fields. He refused to spend money on modern equipment, choosing instead to work entirely with his hands. "My grandfather did it this way," he would often say. "Hard work is the only honest path to success." He planted every seed by hand. He carried water bucket by bucket across the fields. He pulled every weed himself. From dawn until dusk, Thomas worked without pause. His hands were rough and bleeding. His back ached constantly. Yet he wore his exhaustion like a badge of honor. At night, he collapsed into bed too tired to eat properly and too exhausted to spend meaningful time with his wife, Sarah. She would watch him with concern and say, "Thomas, you're destroying yourself. There has to be a better way." But Thomas always shook his head. "Success requires sacrifice," he insisted. "Hard work never fails. I simply need to work harder." The neighboring farmers admired his determination, though many quietly pitied him. "That man works harder than anyone," they would say. And honestly, if effort alone created wealth, Thomas would have been the richest man in the valley. But reality told a different story. Despite working twice as many hours as most of his neighbors, Thomas's farm produced barely enough to survive. Every harvest felt like a struggle. Every season pushed him closer to debt. His crops were average. His yields were mediocre. And worst of all, he had no time, no energy, and no life outside of work. Next to Thomas's farm lived another farmer named Richard. Richard was the same age, owned the same amount of land, and had started with even fewer resources. Yet there was one important difference. Richard worked only until early afternoon, about 6 hours each day. He used modern irrigation systems, hired seasonal help when necessary, and spent his evenings reading, resting, and traveling with his family. And somehow, Richard's farm consistently produced twice the results. That fact haunted Thomas. Then came the drought. One brutal summer, water became scarce throughout the valley. Every farmer faced the same challenge: how to keep crops alive with limited resources. Thomas responded the only way he knew how: by working harder. He woke even earlier. He carried heavy buckets of water from a distant well, making dozens of exhausting trips every day. His body protested constantly, but he ignored the pain. "Hard work never fails," he repeated to himself like a prayer. Meanwhile, Richard simply adjusted his irrigation system to distribute water more efficiently during cooler hours, reducing evaporation and conserving resources. 15 days into this punishing routine, Thomas finally collapsed. He was carrying another heavy bucket when his vision blurred. His legs gave out beneath him and the bucket slipped from his hands, spilling precious water into the dry soil. Thomas fell between rows of dying crops, struggling to breathe as his heart pounded violently in his chest. Sarah found him there, too weak to stand. The doctor's diagnosis was direct and alarming. "Your body is shutting down. You're severely dehydrated, sleep-deprived, and dangerously close to a heart attack. If you continue like this, you may not live to see the next harvest." That night, Lying in bed with IV fluids running through his arm, Thomas stared silently at the ceiling and experienced something he had never allowed himself to feel before. Defeat. Not defeat from the drought. Not defeat from bad luck or difficult circumstances, but defeat from realizing that the very belief guiding his life might have been wrong. "I did everything right," he whispered to Sarah. "I worked harder than everyone else. I sacrificed everything. Why am I still failing?" Sarah gently took his hand. "Maybe hard work isn't the entire answer," she said softly. "Maybe there's something you still need to learn." Those words stayed with him. 3 days later, once he regained enough strength to walk, Thomas did something his pride had prevented him from doing for years. He knocked on Richard's door. Richard welcomed him inside with genuine concern. "Thomas, I heard what happened. Please come in." The two men sat together on Richard's porch, overlooking the thriving green fields. Thomas stared quietly at the healthy crops, torn between envy and curiosity. Finally, he spoke. "Richard, I need to understand something. I work twice as many hours as you do. I give everything I have to this farm, yet you work half the time and produce twice the results. How?" Richard remained silent for a moment before standing. "Come with me," he said. He led Thomas to his tool shed and picked up 2 axes, one old and dull, the other sharp and polished. "Imagine 2 woodcutters competing to chop down trees," Richard began. "The first swings his axe non-stop for 12 straight hours because he believes more effort always means more results." Richard handed Thomas the dull axe and pointed toward a thick log. "Try it." Thomas swung repeatedly. The axe barely marked the wood. He kept going until he was breathing heavily, yet the log remained mostly untouched. Then Richard picked up the sharpened axe. 4 clean swings later, the log split neatly in half. "The second woodcutter works fewer hours," Richard explained, "but he regularly stops to sharpen his axe. The first man mocks him for wasting time. Yet by the end of the day, the second man cuts down twice as many trees." Richard looked directly into Thomas's eyes. "You are the first woodcutter, my friend. You've been swinging a dull axe for years." Then Richard shared 3 principles that changed Thomas's life. First, systems are more powerful than raw effort. "I don't carry water by hand," Richard explained. "I built an irrigation system that handles the work efficiently. You spend hours hauling buckets, while my system completes the same task in minutes." Second, focus creates results. "I grow only the crops best suited for this land. You divide your attention across too many things. I focus deeply on a few." Third, rest is part of productivity. "I sleep properly, I exercise, I take breaks. That keeps my mind sharp enough to make good decisions. You're so exhausted that you spend your life reacting instead of thinking strategically." Richard placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "You are not failing because you lack discipline or effort. You're failing because hard work is the only tool you know." He paused before continuing. "There's a difference between motion and progress, between being busy and being effective." Then he pointed toward the fields. "Hard work matters, but hard work without strategy becomes unnecessary suffering. You need to sharpen your axe." Thomas returned home that evening with a mind full of questions, and for the first time in years, a sense of hope. Instead of rushing back into endless labor, he sat down with Sarah and a notebook. "Teach me how to think differently," he said. The next morning, Thomas worked fewer hours and spent the remaining time researching irrigation systems, visiting agricultural offices, and creating actual plans instead of merely reacting to problems. Within weeks, he sold unused equipment and installed a simple drip irrigation system. Suddenly, the task that once consumed most of his day required only minutes. The extra time allowed him to improve soil quality, study crop patterns, and focus on high-value work instead of exhausting manual labor. He reduced the number of crops he grew and focused only on those best suited for his land. Instead of being average at 5 things, he became exceptional at 2. He hired seasonal help when necessary. He began planning strategically instead of trying to outwork every obstacle. And slowly, everything changed. But the greatest transformation was not his farm. It was his life. For the first time in years, Thomas sat down for dinner with Sarah. They laughed together again. He had energy to spend time with his children. He exercised regularly. He slept properly. He thought clearly. People throughout the valley began noticing the difference. "Thomas," they said, "you're working less, but you seem healthier and happier than ever." Thomas would smile and reply, "I finally realized that exhausted people rarely make great decisions." 6 months later, the next harvest arrived. Thomas's farm produced more than ever before, not because he worked harder, but because every hour of effort now carried purpose, focus, and strategy. He worked half the hours he once did, yet achieved far greater results. One evening, Richard walked through Thomas's transformed farm and nodded with quiet approval. "You learned the lesson," he said. "Now you're not just a hard worker, you're a smart one." Thomas shook his hand gratefully. "Thank you for showing me there's more than one way to build a meaningful life. And perhaps that lesson is for you as well." Because Thomas's story is not really about farming. It's about every person who believes exhaustion equals success. Every person who mistakes constant busyness for real progress. But here is the truth many people never learn. Hard work is necessary, but by itself, it is not enough. The most successful people are not always the ones working the longest hours. More often, they are the ones using their time, energy, and focus most intelligently. So remember these 3 things. Before working harder, ask whether there is a smarter system. Focus deeply on a few meaningful priorities instead of scattering your energy everywhere. And never forget that rest is not the enemy of productivity. It is an essential part of it. A tired mind makes costly mistakes. A rested mind recognizes opportunities. So this week, look closely at the task consuming most of your time and ask yourself one important question. Is there a smarter way to do this? Because you are not a machine designed to work until it breaks. You are a human being capable of creating leverage, systems, and strategy. Stop swinging the dull axe. It's time to sharpen it.